as young people, right, oftentimes, I'm going to wake it up, right? We're called faggot before we're called nigga. And that faggot has so much impact, and people don't recognize it. We have to be armored coming into this world.
Yeah.
And so because of that, we don't get a chance to actually be soft.
Yes.
To be loved,
Yes.
to be loving to other people.
Yes.
So oftentimes, we are brash, right? We have to be, because literally my employer's gonna look at me sideways. So I know when I show up for an interview or all these things, right? We have to code switch, and we have to put on our armor, right, in order to get to our means,
Yes.
by any means necessary.
Yes.
And that is so true and relevant for queer people, Black queer folk, to be
Yeah.
specific.
I can't help but these, cause they know they can never touch these. So baby, let me talk my shit, or I might just go another feed.
Wagwan, everybody. I am Donovan.
And I'm Constanza Eliana, and we are back for another discussion. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So today, we had a lot of talk behind the scenes around what the queer community is going through right now. And for me specifically, I really wanted to give space for having an open conversation around the current climate. It really seems like the queer community is under attack by conservatives, but really just being queer has been under attack for a long time. And so we really wanted to ask the question if the queer community feels safe right now. And I want to start the conversation with Elijahdā.
Well, interesting. So I do drag as well. So no, but out of drag, maybe most of the time, but recently in drag, no. There's this weird agenda that, trying to say that, most queer people, they always viewed us as perverts, sexual deviants, But now, I personally think it's a distraction from the shootings in the schools. Drag queens being a new political pawn is a distraction, but it scares me because motherfuckers are now showing up to like events, brunches, arms, and masks for, and so like I do a drag brunch and a kid showed up. They didn't show up randomly. The patron brought their daughter, even though it was a 21 event. And yes, it's a restaurant, anyone can eat. But I immediately became anxious because oftentimes seeing a drag queen now in a picture, of course you want that parent, want their kids to give the drag queen the dollar. That picture can go viral for all negative reasons. So now I'm getting death threats or hate because that kid shouldn't be here, even though that's the daughter of the owner of the restaurant. Or again, the parent made that choice to bring them. So that's the most recent form of unsafe that I'm experiencing. And even out of drag too, I'm androgynous. So the other experience I feel as if, what are you? And then it's the safety of, also people assume I'm a woman. So oftentimes when I speak, they're like, oh wait, you not. So then it's like, oh, you tricked me, or what the fuck, make your mind up. Or so it's that, also that, okay, how am I going to be treated today? Or am I going to be mistreated when I go outside? Or even my neighbors don't even know what I am, but also I come in many shapes and forms at my apartment. So oftentimes it's not even eye contact. It's, oh, hi. And a dismissive, like I see you, but I don't see you, or I want to acknowledge you. So
Right.
Do you live around Black people, mixed people? Like, what's
yes, and well, so where I live in New Jersey, I live near Seton Hall. So it's a lot of my neighbors are Black, but one of them are. Everyone else is, I think, is a person of color, but everyone else are like white students because it's a college area. So my apartment, but so a lot of I live in a very middle class white area, college area. So ain't that many niggas, but there are some for the school. But so that does kind of, and not saying that I'm more safe or feel more comfortable around white people, but with me, it's more or less not safe because sometimes race issues may come up. I don't want to walk to my house and they think I don't live there, or also I don't want to, because I live where I work is not too far from where I live. So, I try to keep my ID on me at my job because I work with white clients, and oftentimes they assume that I'm a health aide or I don't belong there with these white people helping them out, because I work with clients with disabilities. So that's the other weird thing, is like being in this white area, you think, oh, because there's white people, you're safe, but no, because then now they're questioning my existence or why I'm there or doing those things. So
Right.
Thank you for that, because that is violence. But I was interested why I asked about who you were around, because I remember, this was a long time ago, it wasn't recent. But I remember when I was like feeling bold and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna wear these purple skinny jeans. I'm gonna wear these fucking like rain boots that were white. And I stepped out in that house. I made it a block before somebody clowned the shit out of me. She's like, oh, you sexy. So you wanna date him, huh? You wanna date him? To like her homegirl asked to say, look at this dude with these purple ass jeans on. I turned around and immediately went back home and changed. Oh, no. But I, you know, I didn't have I'm not who I am now, right? Like I would boldly go out my house however I feel like now. But at that time, you know, safety was just always such a huge concern. And right now with this rise of conservatism, but let's alt-rightness, a lot of times we're like, okay, well, if we're in community with black folks, maybe it's not the same. So I was just trying to figure out, like, what is that like to actually be around white folks? Because they are the ones who right now are going to places and shooting up people, no shade. I'm not to say that black folks don't, but specifically this more mass murder, going to protests outside of drag brunches and stuff like that are happening with a lot of white men who are going through an identity crisis. And I know that like first and foremost for them, it's about race. I know that it's like, ooh, about whiteness, but secondly, it's the gender thing. Like they go so hard, and I realize that I'm like, how does that affect someone like you who's actually
I
like
also work at like a Jewish organization as well. So working, like a month ago, we had Newark, New Jersey issued a safety warning because a synagogue got a threat. So like that's another like thing we have to worry about too, like because it is a Jewish organization.
So safety is like at the forefront of your lived experience
like we just
every
recently
day.
had a gun safety drill and everything. That's so
yeah.
I think for me, being gay is unsafe. Being black is unsafe. So being a black gay man, I'm constantly in a state of paranoia because I never feel safe. And I don't know which way you're going with it, because you can go either way or you could be mad for both, which means I really have to be looking out for my environment and what's happening around me. But I've always kind of been conscious of that as someone who has a feminine features. Like I have the hair. I have a lot going on. I have the hair. I like leather. Like I like dressing and all that stuff, but it draws attention to me. And a lot of times for the wrong reason. And so I never felt safe in white spaces because I knew that my blackness was a threat to them. And in black spaces, I felt safe, but there was still a undertone of unsafe because I knew that the gay thing was a problem. And we were still working that out in our community. So it's a constant state of having to always be on guard, at least for me, because I never know which way you're going to try to come at me from. That was just my experience growing up. And even now, like as an adult, as a confident black gay male, I still have to like look over my shoulder. I have to make sure I'm like watching what's happening. I have to read the room when I walk in certain rooms, even like going out to clubs or going out to events. I have to read the room and see like who's giving me a little too much eye contact and why are you looking at me like that and what are you saying to your homegirl, and it's tiring, but I mean, if I don't do it, who else is going to do it for me?
I mean, facts. Qween, I see you agreeing.
I'm honestly, so much of what you're sharing resonates, and I'll take it a point further. I honestly feel like as black queer folks, right, and queer being all-encompassing, trans folks, gender non-conforming, you know, people have been non-binary since before B. Scott, okay? People have always been queer, but I will say that in terms of safety, for myself and my generation, I have never known a moment in our history where we felt safe. We've always existed in crisis, and to be quite honest, to me, violence and safety wasn't afforded to us. We didn't feel safe at church growing up. No. We didn't feel safe at schools, in any places where, even like after school programs or any of those things, I think as folks who show up and are manifested or deemed visibly queer, visibly different, visibly othered, safety is not something that you are afforded. And so I think for as a community at large, because we know this, we've just had to make do. We just have to exist within these confines. And to be honest, I'm sick and fed of it. I'm tired of having to feel anxious. I would say, to be honest, the moments where I feel alive is when I'm around community. It's when I'm in literally cultivated spaces that are intended for us to have peace, for us to feel like we have a sense of sanctuary, which honestly is very hard to find and to sustain. Because as we know, literally, I mean, this is really kind of affirming to be around so many folks in community who live out loud. But there are people who may not have the capacity to live out loud, the resources to live out loud. And so I often think about them as well, because they're just trying to live. But truly, the other forces that are stacked up against them truly make it, honestly, unsafe at all times.
Yeah, 100%. You know, even recently on the Stranger Fruits Instagram page and like some other place, we put up a post that was speaking about, I think it was it colorism?
Yes.
It was about colorism. And forget the colorism shit. Everybody couldn't wait to talk about who these gay people having this conversation, you know? And it became all about queerness and the commentary, like the you see, like for me, I'm gonna tell you like this, like there are certain times where it's just like you gotta tell somebody to shut the fuck up. Yeah. I think as queer people, like a lot of times I'm like, there's nothing that you can say that could hurt my feelings. Yeah. The motherfucker who could hurt my feelings has not been born yet. But I am not going to allow you to bully either. Yeah. You know, the read game and the cuss out game is strong. I grew up in the hood. Yeah. So much so with the violence that you're talking about, I talk about this often, but even thinking to myself, I have to learn how to fight.
Yes.
I have to learn how to fight because I am out here in these streets and I know these motherfuckers aren't fucking with me. I know they're not because it's everywhere. It's in the music. It's what they say when they're passing by me in the street. Even if they're not talking about me, I hear this shit. It's all around. It's all over the place. And then at that time in the 90s coming up, it was reaffirmed in the media where like it was like over and over and over again. All of these years later on Instagram, people are coming out with the same shit. It's like, yo, like when are we gonna evolve and when are we gonna get to the next step? I firmly believe that Black folks in particular, people who identify as others, who play in the margins of society, fight for privilege. And this is one of the easiest ways to feel powerful, to really just try to alienate queer people in particular and like not give two fucks about trying to even understand. You know, so I really appreciate the fact, Qween, that you said that you feel affirmed in these kinds of spaces, because I know for a lot of us, even to get to a point where, like you said, to feel safe enough to live out loud, it took a lot. A lot of us had to lose family. A lot of us had to lose shelter. We did not have the privilege of being able to say like, oh shit, I got kicked out of my house. I can go live with somebody else. There are a lot of queer people who commit suicide. This is not just a happenstance. This is like actual humanity that's on the line. And I know, brother, for you, like, this is William, by the way, I call you brother. But how has it been for you? Because I know like you grew up with, raised by men, right? And as a queer man, how has your experience with safety been and how do you feel now?
So even to like connect these things, I think when it comes to the safety of queer people, that's always been into question. But I will say I do feel safer because the community has gotten stronger. And I think that's where my safety lies now, because before it was outside of everybody else treating me bad and me not having a place to be or belong to in that, right? So where are my people? Because I know I'm getting it, but where are my people? So that's what makes me feel unsafe. I feel a lot more safer in the community because now I identify who has my back, who those people are. And within the queer community in general, I can't help but bring up the divisiveness that lives in there and the violence that lives in the queer community when we ostracize those other people now that we have more labels, now that we have more identities, right? And now it's like, oh, well, I was just gay and now you're bringing all this other shit.
That's true. People say
this
that.
Is weird, right? So I even think about 10 years ago where a lot of like gay folk, Black gay folk weren't fucking with trans people like that. It was very like, you stay over there, I stay over here.
Lesbians
It's still
too.
like that.
Lesbians too.
It still is like that, but what I will say is that I've seen there a more rally behind trans people, because just like we say, dismantling all of these systems, you have to go to the bottom. And unfortunately, Black trans women are at the bottom. And I know that if my community, if I want to feel safe, that I have to help the bottom, right? So I think that is where now I'm seeing a little bit more safety, but I think it's a more like, we are saving ourselves. We are creating the safety net outside of what the fuck is already going on.
What
That's
you
a
were
really
talking
big
about is we always talk about the proximity to whiteness, but we don't talk about, well, of course they're not going to talk about because you're straight, but gay people don't talk about the proximity to straightness.
Okay, all right, well, let's talk about it
Proximity
then.
to
G.
whiteness, proximity to straightness. So just like in the Black community, we have these hierarchies that happen where, you know, lighter skinned people are closer to whiteness. You know, this closer to whiteness. This, everybody's trying to be closer to whiteness, so they don't want to fuck with somebody that's underneath them in the totem pole because it's like you're pulling me down here when I'm trying to like get as close to this as I can because I know I can never be this. It's the same thing with straightness. That's why you see a lot of queer community, like it starts with like the masculine men that don't fuck with feminine men, and then it's now none of these people fuck with the trans people, and then it just goes down the hierarchy because everybody's trying to be as close to straightness as they can be without being there because they feel like that's where they'll be at their safest point.
And that's such a mindfuck because it's just like you're just trying to scramble for something, right? You're dumped into this place where you already have nothing, and now you have to figure out where you belong in it all, and it's all rooted in trauma. So again, it's like, especially when you think about like queerness, like now a lot more people are out, a lot more it's trendy, right? You have people, more so like white people waving the flags, but it wasn't like that. And I think there was a lot of trauma and a lot of people trying to figure out who the fuck they were in the midst of trying to feel safe and not getting killed, and still like, I have to belong here, I'm gonna have to work, so where do I find myself? And it becomes like a mind fuck. It becomes confusing because it's layered trauma, things that become layered on top of just existing, right?
Mm-hmm. To add on, like,
Thank you, William.
proximity to straightness is also, again, based in white heteronormativity, because essentially, white supremacy is the basis of patriarchy. And again, us queer black men are trying to subscribe to something, again, that was never made for black people, let alone queer black people in mind. So again, it's like chasing something you can never ever reach. But black gay men are still sexist, misogynistic, and transphobic the same way black cis hetero men can be. And most of us, not all of us, are still trying to, what I call that white penis and be. Being able to get away with things that white men get away with, but in reality we can't. We know this. But go on. Sorry.
Go ahead, Charles.
But with Juice and William, what y'all were saying really hit me, and I've been a little bit emotional here, like listening to everybody, because it's crazy how we have very similar experiences. Well, it's not crazy because it's really understandable. But I think for myself, growing up as a queer person, I'm in an archetype where I can pass as straight. I can, if I put on the right clothes, if I walk, however, whatever.
Deepen that voice just enough.
Deepen that voice enough, then I can pass as someone who's straight. And I didn't realize just how privileged that was until I stepped into spaces in college where it was more queer spaces, and they were like starting like, oh yeah, we want to have, allies. And they didn't think that I was a part of the community. And I was like, oh, wait, what is this? What does this mean? What is like, what are you seeing me as, and how am I stepping in these spaces where the archetype of who I am is triggering to someone else because someone that looked like me, someone who has the same build, enacted violence on our queer and trans sisters. And so I think that it's really important, like you were saying, for people who, especially black queer men who are cis men, to understand the privilege that we have and to lend a hand and to be more vocal and to, be more affirming to our trans sisters and non-binary people, brothers and sisters.
It's in our liberation as well.
Exactly. And I live in Atlanta right now, and then I'm in a space where, and I'm also in ballroom, so I'm in a space where it's nothing but queer folks loving on each other and affirming one another. And even though there are some issues with ballroom culture, of course, I feel safe, the safest I've ever felt in those spaces. And that's because it was cultivated for us, by us. And I think that if we were able to take what we've built in ballroom culture and in queer culture and sort of, permeate that out through our friends and family that we know, and they are able then to see our humanity, because I think that at its basis, if people were able to see that we are human first and foremost, then we'll be able to actually live in this world in safety and in care.
I just think there's something missing from the conversation though too, because for me, I kind of always been out, and not necessarily of me coming out though, but I had parents where I was just being myself. So there was never a space where I felt like I was ever acting different or I was outside of somebody else. And my dad comes from the hood of Gary, Indiana, so it's not like this is something that just randomly came out of nowhere though. But he did have like a queer cousin that at the time he saw him grow up, do certain things or whatever, and it was never talked about, but he respected that person. That's the person that he actually cared about a lot. He was killed because he was gay, but I think me coming up, I was way more sheltered than I probably needed to be. So I lived in this world of a bubble of me just being myself. I had no recollection of what queerness was exactly. So most of my time I was hanging out with a lot of straight people because it was just, we had the same interests. We like to do the same things.
Yeah.
And I also grew up in Texas. So like here in New York City, it's different. Everyone in the queer community is amongst the creative world. Everything is engulfed, mixed in together. That's not the same in the South all the time. So like queer identities are here. If I'm creative, then I might be over here, and that's mainly saturated with a lot of, hetero people though, but I like being there because we enjoy the same stuff. I think for me, even trying to find a way to integrate into queer life, that was very hard for me because one, I didn't have that many queer friends. I didn't understand what that looked like as a whole. I was looked at as different because I acted in a certain way that people didn't really understand because I was just being myself. And I didn't really identify with a lot of things that other queer people were going through. I wasn't thrown out of my house. I wasn't kicked out. I had parental issues, of course, but these are not things that I had to think about and do. Wow. I wasn't even experiencing, I guess, queer violence maybe until I got to college, because then you're dealing with a lot of different people that are not from where you're from. No, I think it's also just a way of, there's a lot of things that are not out there, especially in the 80s and 90s. I didn't see me. I didn't start seeing myself on TV probably until 2000s, maybe. I think so. It's like, I think there needs to be an understanding of that you might act in a certain way, or there might be a proximity to straightness because there's certain people who have been sheltered enough to be in some world of a bubble that you didn't even understand what violence was. I didn't even understand what racism was, and I was living in the South because I was so in this bubble. I didn't hear nothing until I think my mom picked me up from middle school, and some white people drove down and like called my mom the N-word and like along with bitch, and literally my first time ever hearing that word before. And the only thing I heard her do was like laugh. But that's because she dealt with it all her life, though. But it's something that I never like physically seen. Like I knew something was there, but like, so I think there needs to be an understanding of like, there's some ignorance to certain things. There's certain ways to be in proximity to certain things because you just your mind wasn't open up to all this other stuff. And then now you have to figure out what your identity is. And now you have to figure out what you look like within this community that they look like they're together, but that's because all the things that they have, their trauma was the same. Their ideals were the same. I'm coming into a space where I didn't really feel like I connected with all those people. So most of the time I struggled a lot trying to figure out what queerness looked like for me. Was I supposed to look like this? Am I supposed to be doing this now? What is this supposed to be like? And then you start, getting into the world and you're getting queer violence and you're like, well, fuck, I'm still trying to figure out what the fuck I am now. And I don't even know if I fit here. Do I fit here? What does this look like as a whole though too? So I just think that kind of mindset needs to be,
nuance, that nuanced perspective of like even our exposure and what happens when we're exposed to queerness, even if you are a part of the community. Right. Because I think like that's an interesting, I kind of went through something very similarly. Like it was like, how do I fit into this space? Like, I'm not, because and at that time, I'm interested to hear what you have to say too, Isaam. We're gonna go to you next, but I know like growing up in New York in particular, it was kind of like it was homo thug era. Sorry, like I don't know what else to call it, like B-boy blues, homo thug era. It was like a thing, and I was not that. So even at that time, right? Like, because out here in New York, we have the Pier over at Christopher Street. And it was a place that a lot of like young, gay, queer, trans folks used to go just to build community with one another. And I remember just like going there and just like having this like trepidation, like what is gonna happen? Like, am I gonna meet somebody? Are these people gonna like me? It was all of that. I think it's a part of the experience. What I think is interesting is like how privilege comes into play. Yeah. Because privilege can determine how you're accepted. It can also play into like how much people make you do work in terms of like acquiring friendships, whether or not people flock to you. Right. So I think that's interesting. Yes, exactly. I would love to hear from you. Oh, we'll come to you next, Qween. I would love to hear from you, Isaam, about like your experience about like stepping into your queerness, safety, and like how you fit into the community.
My queerness stepped into me long before I stepped into it.
Okay.
And so I was being called gay long before I knew what it was.
Right.
So stepping into that when I realized who I was a challenge because I didn't have the safety of anyone vouching for me or supporting me in that kind of way. It was a conversation that was never to be had. And so whenever I did speak on things that affected me. It was like, well, it's not true, so don't talk about it. It's not happening. And I'm like, but it is happening. And like, you know, physically being attacked because people are like, you're gay, we're gonna beat you up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like navigating that and not having spaces to go to. Like, you know, like when I was in middle school, that's the early 90s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like there were no like gay clubs, like school clubs. There were no like
after school
Yeah.
LGBTQ plus club.
Yeah, there was none of that for me. So it was like hard to find that. So when I eventually found that way, to me, I've always felt the responsibility to look back and like, if I see someone like, let me create a space for myself and for my people. Like too many times I found safety in isolation and like in routine and going, I know where I can go. I can't maybe not go there.
Yeah.
So let me figure that out. So a lot of trial and error. And it wasn't really until I went to Florida, you know, there was some safety in New York after a while. It was like, okay, I can go this spot, I can go this spot, and I could be gay and nobody will bother me, right? But when I was to Florida, and there were picketers, telling me I was gonna burn in hell, like meeting me at every door.
You'll get used to it.
This was different for me, right? You know, I was used to seeing it one way.
Yeah.
This was a whole nother way that was direct and in your face, where everything else before was like kind of like underhanded and cutting in another way. That I'm just glad that people have more options today.
Yeah.
And that there are platforms like this that like lift our voices up and like create a safe space for us, because there are too many that people can find comfort in.
Because I learned in the club.
You said you go to the club?
I learned in the club. I didn't have a lot of, you know, I'm from Delaware. There wasn't a lot of gay, like there's no gay. I think there's one gay bar in Delaware that I just discovered in my 30s. But there wasn't no like gay alliance at school. There was none of that. All there was like none of that. All there was TV. And then I was in the clubs at 16, and I was learning from the older people that was in the clubs and was teaching me the do's and don'ts, and don't do this and don't do that, which is actually very, very dangerous, because it only would have taken for me to run into the wrong person. Luckily, I ran into the right people on that path, so I learned a lot, and then I started picking up my own like street smarts. But I mean, it only took that. I've seen people go down the wrong path, but how do you blame them? There was nobody to talk to.
Yes.
They were literally talking to anybody that was reaching out their hand, and everybody doesn't reach their hand out with grace and love.
No, not at all.
But when you're struggling, you just need a hand at this point.
And you'll grab it.
And you'll grab it, not even knowing that you're putting yourself in more danger.
Yeah, you know, it's so funny because Will and I were talking about this recently about, like, you know, what I consider a part of the violence out of our community is that once you get to a certain age as a queer person, as a gay person, it's almost like you disappear, right? Like we had this conversation, like what happens to people when they get, I can't find you no place. And I think it's a couple of things. One is that you may say to yourself, okay, I'm a certain age, I'm not gonna go to the clubs anymore right now, I'm not feeling, my knees ain't doing that. And then and outside of that, it's almost like you go back to your early 20s or your late teens of trying to find out what's next? Is it just like kickbacks with the homies? You hope that you would have some, right? God forbid you move to a new town. How do you meet people? How do you find mentorship? How do you find other people in the community who have found success, romantic success, or just a way to just like be, or, you know, have a great career? Because like one of the things that I think that we often forget about this pipeline and knowing how we can see ourselves in the future is economic violence, specifically against queer people. And this is something that my cousin Drea was talking about. She couldn't make it on the show, but she was like, oh my gosh, and I really want to talk about economic violence. I was like, well, tell me the tea. I'll tell the people the tea. And essentially what she was saying is that as a trans woman, it could be so difficult for her to be able to find a job, for example, right? So to be able to find a job and like how that there's a pipeline there for a type of violence that is not as overt as physical violence or hearing something about, oh, this person was killed. No, the type of violence that says you don't get to have a career, you don't get to be able to feed yourself. Laws, exactly. So you can't be yourself. Discrimination, housing discrimination, like lots of different things that are just so violent and so prevalent that we don't often talk about. Qween, I'm interested to know, do you feel represented? Do you feel seen? Like we have folks like Laverne Cox, we have Janet Mock, it's amazing, it's great. But do you still feel seen? I'm talking about within the community and out.
Yeah, that's the word. I mean, oh my gosh. Do I feel seen? I mean, I feel seen because I see myself. Point blank, period.
Amen.
I mean, honestly, I think that for a long time, and I wanted to circle back because I loved what you said about this idea of desirability, but I'll take it a step further. I mean, to me, it also feels about this thing, this notion of a validation, right? And to me, the validation starts literally from the very, very beginning. As Black people, as Black young men, Black queer women, all these, we have to be valid, right? And oftentimes we learn that kind of rhetoric, right, in the barbershop. So to me, safety, literally, I mean, we're learning even in this setting, right, that it's supposed to be about upbringing, history, ritual, like a touchstone in our community, right, oasis. That it's not only about grooming, but it's about culture. It's about learning. It's about learning to become a young person in this world, to be a thinker, to be an intellect, to be an artist, whoever you are. But literally, I can't speak for Patty, but I can speak for the version of myself as a young person, right, feeling completely terrified going into those spaces, whether or not I wanted to shape up a lineup, but I always was this, right? I've never been not Qween. So even as a young person, it's always been Qween, but showing up in that space to sit in that barber chair, it was terrifying.
Yeah.
And that safety, literally, we don't know what that safety is. And I would, just to circle back, but as young people, right, oftentimes, I'm gonna wake it up, right? We're called faggot before we're called nigga. And that faggot has so much impact and people don't recognize it until like literally you're now in a relationship and it's like, oh, this is destructive, right? You don't actually have experiences or practices of love or things that have actually shaped and molded you to be the young person that you are or who you will become. And I often feel like as young queer people, right, I love what you said about isolation, right? Growing and learning in isolation. And it's in that moment that we are the most unsafe. I don't know how many young people I know, right, who literally have navigated through chats, websites, portals, different ways for them to actually be seen, different ways for them to connect to other queer people, because they can't openly do it in school.
Right.
I mean, if I grew up in a school, where the queer boys were on, what's the little thing called, like the little seesaw, whatever it was. But like, if we could have existed without it being polarizing, without it actually being destructive, right? We would not have this this notion of safety for us to always have to be armored as queer people. We have to be armored coming into this world. And so because of that, we don't get a chance to actually be soft. To be loved, to be loving to other people. So oftentimes, we are brash, right? We have to be, because literally my employer is gonna look at me sideways. So I know when I show up for an interview or all these things, right? We have to code switch and we have to put on our armor, right? In order to get to our means, by any means necessary. And that is so true and relevant for queer people, Black queer folk, to be specific. And to your point, whether I see myself, I see Qween. What I will also say is that I think within the last 5 to 10 years, 5 to 10, there's been we're in an era of awakening, right? Where trans people aren't just, the thing that we talk about, right? No, trans people are our family. Like we have cousins that are trans, we have sisters that are trans, we have mothers that are trans that we don't always acknowledge. We have caretakers that are trans that we do not give the reverence that they deserve. And so I would say that for me, it's changing. But as we know, change takes so long. Somehow, being able to proudly and openly love a trans woman questions not only your manhood, but your identity, your power, your strength, your status.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And
your power. Somehow you are empowered, right, if you're seen or attached or affiliated with a Black trans woman, right? And so there's colorism. I mean, there is a multitude, I think, of things to unpack. But truly, the burden rests on our shoulders. It rests on our bodies. We are the ones, right? They spit on you, but then you hit me. You'll shoot me. You'll stab me.
Yes.
And that's the reality. And literally, you are my neighbor. You're my nigga. You're me. But you are so afraid that somebody's gonna call your little punk ass gay.